The steel door slammed shut with a sound that would echo in Marcus Webb's nightmares for years to come. 23 hours a day in a 6-by-8-foot cell. 1 hour in a concrete yard surrounded by razor wire and dead eyes. This was his new reality, and it had happened so fast that his mind still struggled to process the impossible truth. He was innocent, but science itself had condemned him. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. That's what the prosecutor had said, standing before the jury with the confidence of a man holding 4 aces. The genetic material found on the victim's clothing, under her fingernails, on the ligature used to strangle her, it all matched Marcus Webb's DNA profile with a probability of 1 in 7 billion. The expert witness, a woman with 20 years of experience in forensic genetics, had testified that the chances of error were essentially 0. The defense attorney, a public defender juggling 87 cases simultaneously, had offered no meaningful challenge. What could he say? DNA doesn't lie. That was the phrase everyone kept repeating. DNA doesn't lie. Marcus had no explanation for how his genetic signature ended up at a crime scene in a house he'd never entered, in a neighborhood he'd never visited, on a night when he'd been home alone watching television. No witnesses could corroborate his alibi. He lived by himself in a modest apartment on the east side, worked third shift at a warehouse kept to himself. The kind of invisible existence that became a liability when you needed people to vouch for your whereabouts. The kind of life that made you vulnerable when the system decided you were guilty. The victim was Sarah Brennan, a 34-year-old accountant who had been murdered in her home with shocking brutality. She was the 3rd woman killed in identical fashion over 18 months. Same method of entry through a basement window. Same type of ligature. Same careful staging of the body afterward. The city had been gripped by fear, demanding answers, demanding justice. And when Marcus's DNA appeared at the 3rd crime scene, the police and prosecutors moved with the swift certainty of people who believed they'd finally caught a monster. But Marcus Webb wasn't a monster. He was a 31-year-old man who'd grown up in foster care, who'd worked hard to build a quiet, law-abiding life from nothing, who'd never even had a speeding ticket. He'd tried to tell them. In the interrogation room, handcuffed to a table for 11 hours, he'd maintained his innocence with increasing desperation. He'd volunteered everything, his work schedule, his computer passwords, his phone records, anything that might prove he wasn't the killer. The detectives had listened with expressions of theatrical patience, then confronted him again with the evidence. Your DNA was there, Marcus. Your DNA was on her body. How do you explain that? He couldn't explain it. That was the problem that destroyed him. In the modern justice system, DNA evidence carries a weight that borders on mystical. Juries hear those 3 letters and the case is effectively over. The trial lasted 6 days. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, guilty on all counts. 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd seen genuine monsters parade through her courtroom for decades, showed no mercy. She looked at Marcus as if he were something diseased and dangerous, something that needed to be removed from society forever. Now, 3 months into his sentence at Whitmore Correctional Facility, Marcus existed in a state of numb horror. The other inmates knew what he'd been convicted of. Serial killer. Murderer of women. There's a hierarchy even in hell, and men like him occupy the lowest rung. He'd been beaten twice in his first month. A guard had looked the other way while 3 men cornered him in the shower room, delivering a message about what happens to woman killers in this place. Marcus had learned to move through the facility like a ghost, eyes down, speaking to no one, trusting no one. But the physical danger was almost bearable compared to the psychological torture of knowing the truth. He was innocent. Completely, absolutely innocent. And nobody believed him. Not his overworked public defender, who'd stopped returning his calls after the conviction. Not the appeals attorney who'd briefly reviewed his case and told him there were no grounds for appeal. The trial had been conducted properly, and the evidence was overwhelming. Not the guards, who treated him with contempt. Not the prison counselor, who kept asking him to take responsibility for his actions as the first step toward rehabilitation. every interaction reinforced the same crushing reality. His protestations of innocence were seen as denial, as the pathetic lying of a guilty man who couldn't face what he'd done. His grandmother, the one person who'd shown him kindness during his chaotic childhood, had died 2 weeks after his conviction. Heart attack, probably brought on by the stress and shame. He hadn't been allowed to attend the funeral. She'd visited him once before she died, separated by plexiglass, speaking through a telephone receiver. She'd looked at him with tears streaming down her weathered face and whispered, "I know you didn't do this, baby. I know you." Those were the last words she'd spoken to him. The only person who'd believed him was gone, and he was more alone than he'd ever been in a life marked by abandonment. The worst part came at night. Lying on a thin mattress on a metal bunk, staring at the concrete ceiling in the darkness, Marcus would replay everything in his mind. The crime scene photos the jury had seen. That poor woman, Sarah Brennan, whose life had been stolen by a genuine monster. And somewhere out there, that monster was free, probably laughing at how perfectly everything had worked out. An innocent man was paying for his crimes while he remained free to kill again. Because Marcus knew with absolute certainty that the real killer was still out there. And he knew something else. Something that made his blood run cold in the middle of those endless nights. If his DNA had been at the scene, then there was only one logical explanation. An explanation so impossible that nobody would ever believe it even if he could prove it. The first glimmer of impossible hope came from the most unlikely source. Dr. Jennifer Kowalski wasn't looking to save anyone when she started her research into advanced genetic analysis. She was a molecular biologist at Chapman University, working on techniques to differentiate between DNA from identical twins, a problem that had vexed forensic science for decades. Identical twins share the same genetic code, a fact that had created occasional complications in criminal cases. But Dr. Kowalski believed that tiny mutations, differences that accumulate over a lifetime through environmental factors and random cellular events, might be detectable with sufficiently sophisticated analysis. Her research was academic, theoretical, driven by scientific curiosity rather than any crusade for justice. She'd published a paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences describing a new methodology that could potentially distinguish between identical twins through deep sequencing and analysis of somatic mutations. The paper attracted little attention outside specialized academic circles. But one person did notice it. Harold Brennan, Sarah Brennan's father, a retired engineer who'd spent the 3 years since his daughter's murder becoming an amateur expert in forensic science. Harold had never fully believed that Marcus Webb was guilty. Something about the case felt wrong to him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The speed of the arrest, perhaps. The neat packaging of the evidence. The absence of any clear motive or connection between Webb and the victims. Harold had attended every day of the trial, studying Marcus's face, looking for the evil that should be visible in someone capable of such horror. He'd seen only confusion and fear. That didn't mean Webb was innocent. Harold knew that intellectually. Psychopaths could be skilled actors, but still, doubt gnawed at him. Harold's obsession with his daughter's case had cost him his marriage. His wife couldn't understand why he kept picking at the wound instead of accepting the justice that had been served and trying to heal. But Harold couldn't let it go. Every night he sat in his home office surrounded by printouts of trial transcripts, forensic reports, and academic papers about DNA evidence. He was teaching himself genetics, criminal procedure, forensic methodology. His friends thought he was losing his mind. Maybe he was. But he owed it to Sarah to be absolutely certain they'd caught the right man. When Harold read Dr. Kowalski's paper about twin differentiation, something clicked in his mind. He'd reviewed Marcus Webb's background extensively. Foster care from age 2, no known biological family, medical records that included a notation Harold had barely registered before, single birth recorded, but adoptive family informed that biological mother had given birth to twins, though only one infant was placed in their care. The other twin had been placed separately, location unknown due to sealed adoption records. Marcus Webb had a twin brother, identical twin, with identical DNA. and nobody had thought to investigate this because standard DNA testing couldn't distinguish between them. Harold's hands had trembled as he'd read that medical notation for the 20th time, suddenly seeing its significance. He'd immediately tried to contact Marcus Webb's appeals attorney, but hit a wall of professional indifference. The appeals had been exhausted. The case was closed. Nobody wanted to hear theories from a grieving father who couldn't accept reality. So Harold had contacted Dr. Kowalski directly, explaining the situation in a long, passionate email that he'd sent at 2 a.m. Dr. Kowalski had initially been skeptical. Her research was still developmental, not yet validated for use in actual criminal cases. The legal and ethical complexities were enormous, but Harold was persistent, calling her office, showing up at her university lab, presenting her with binders full of documentation about the Webb case. And slowly, reluctantly, Dr. Kowalski began to see the scientific opportunity. If she could apply her methodology to a real case, particularly one as significant as this, it would validate her research in a way that academic papers never could. But there were massive obstacles. First, they needed access to the original DNA evidence from the crime scene, which was locked in a police evidence room and considered a closed case. Second, even if they could access it, Dr. Kowalski would need samples from both Marcus Webb and his unknown twin brother for comparison. Third, they needed legal standing to even request such testing. And fourth, they needed to find the twin brother, whose identity and location were protected by sealed adoption records and decades of lost time. Harold Brennan proved to be more resourceful than anyone expected. He hired a private investigator who specialized in adoption searches. It took 9 months and most of Harold's retirement savings, but eventually they found him. Daniel Webb, 31 years old, living in a town 200 miles away. Same birth date as Marcus. Different last name because he'd been adopted by a different family. Different life trajectory. Where Marcus had bounced through foster care, Daniel had been raised in a stable, middle-class home. He'd gone to college, worked in sales, gotten married, and divorced. On paper, he looked like a successful, well-adjusted person. But when the investigator dug deeper, disturbing patterns emerged. Daniel had a sealed juvenile record, details unavailable, but apparently serious enough to warrant court intervention when he was 16. He'd been fired from 3 jobs under mysterious circumstances, with former employers reluctant to provide details, but clearly uncomfortable when asked. His ex-wife had filed a restraining order during their divorce citing threatening behavior. And most significantly, his current whereabouts during the times of all 3 murders were unaccounted for. He'd been living alone, unemployed, with no verifiable alibi for any of the nights in question. Harold presented all of this information to Marcus Webb's former public defender, who finally began to pay attention. But the defender was honest about the challenges. Getting a court to reopen a case based on speculation about an unknown twin, particularly when it would require expensive and unproven genetic testing, would be nearly impossible. They needed something more. They needed leverage. They needed someone with power to believe them. That someone turned out to be District Attorney Catherine Mills, but not for the reasons Harold hoped. Mills hadn't suddenly developed doubts about Marcus Webb's guilt. She'd prosecuted him personally and remained convinced of his culpability. But Mills was also ambitious and politically savvy. She was considering a run for Attorney General, and she understood that being associated with cutting-edge forensic science could enhance her reputation as a progressive, thorough prosecutor. When Harold and Dr. Kowalski approached her with the twin theory and the offer to conduct groundbreaking genetic testing at no cost to the state, Mills saw an opportunity. If the testing confirmed Marcus Webb's guilt by ruling out the twin theory, Mills would be validated and could use the case as evidence of her commitment to certainty in the justice system. If, against all odds, the testing somehow exonerated Webb, Mills would be seen as a prosecutor with the integrity to correct mistakes, which could be an even bigger political asset. It was a win-win scenario for her career. The fact that Marcus Webb's life hung in the balance was, to Mills, a secondary consideration. Justice wasn't her primary motivation. Ambition was. But sometimes ambition and justice align, even if for the wrong reasons. Mills agreed to support a motion for additional DNA testing using Dr. Kowalski's methodology. The motion was filed in Superior Court, asking for permission to conduct advanced genetic analysis on the original crime scene evidence and to compel DNA samples from both Marcus Webb and Daniel Webb for comparison. The judge assigned to the motion was skeptical, but intrigued by the scientific novelty. A hearing was scheduled for 6 months later. During those 6 months, Marcus Webb knew nothing about any of this. Nobody had informed him that his case was being re-examined, that he had a twin brother, that there was even a sliver of hope. He continued his grim existence at Whitmore Correctional, surviving day by day, his spirit slowly eroding under the weight of permanent injustice. The courtroom hearing on the motion for additional testing took place on a gray November morning. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and restraints, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist. He'd been transported from Whitmore at 5 that morning, processed through courthouse security like a dangerous animal, and placed in a holding cell until his presence was required. Nobody had explained why he was here. The notice he'd received simply stated that there would be a hearing regarding his case, nothing more. When Marcus was finally brought into the courtroom, he was shocked to see Harold Brennan sitting in the gallery. Sarah Brennan's father, the man whose daughter Marcus had been convicted of murdering, was here, supporting a motion that could potentially free him. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Marcus had seen Harold at trial, had watched the man weep during testimony about Sarah's final moments. Why would he be here now, apparently working to help the person he believed had killed his child? The hearing began with Dr. Kowalski taking the stand to explain her research. She spoke in careful, precise language about somatic mutations, next-generation sequencing, and the scientific basis for distinguishing between identical twins through genetic analysis. The judge, an older man named Reeves who'd been on the bench for 30 years, listened with visible concentration, occasionally interrupting to ask clarifying questions. This was clearly outside his usual experience, and he was taking his responsibility to understand the science seriously. The prosecutor arguing against the motion, an assistant DA named Torres who'd been assigned the case by Catherine Mills, made several valid points. The testing was unproven in court. The cost would be substantial, at least $50,000 for the level of analysis Dr. Kowalski proposed. And most importantly, there was no actual evidence that Marcus Webb had a twin brother beyond some notation in decades-old foster care records. Even if such a person existed, there was no evidence connecting him to the crimes. This was speculation, Torres argued, a desperate attempt to manufacture reasonable doubt after the fact. But then Harold Brennan took the stand and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He wasn't a lawyer or a scientist. He was a father who'd lost his daughter to horrific violence, and his testimony carried moral weight that transcended legal technicalities. He explained his journey, his initial acceptance of the verdict, his growing doubts, his obsessive research. He described finding the reference to Marcus's twin in the adoption records, hiring the investigator, locating Daniel Webb. And then he revealed information that made even Judge Reeves lean forward with interest. Harold's investigator had continued working after Daniel was located. He'd conducted surveillance, interviewed people who knew Daniel, built a profile, and what he'd discovered was chilling. Daniel Webb had a history of violence against women that had been carefully hidden behind sealed records and confidential settlements. The juvenile incident had involved an assault on a female classmate. The job terminations were related to harassment complaints. The restraining order from his ex-wife included allegations of physical abuse and threats to kill her. And most significantly, Daniel's vehicle, a dark blue sedan, matched the description of a car that had been reported near one of the crime scenes around the time of the murder. Torres objected strenuously. This was hearsay, speculation, character assassination of a person who wasn't even charged with any crime. But Harold's testimony had accomplished its purpose. It established reasonable doubt about whether Marcus Webb was actually guilty. The existence of an identical twin with a history of violence against women and no verifiable alibis for the murder dates was at minimum worthy of investigation. Denying the motion for advanced testing would mean potentially leaving a serial killer free, while an innocent man rotted in prison. Judge Reeves recessed the hearing for 2 hours to review the scientific literature Dr. Kowalski had submitted. When court reconvened, his decision was measured but clear. He was granting the motion for additional DNA testing using Dr. Kowalski's advanced methodology. The state would be required to provide samples from the crime scene evidence. Marcus Webb's DNA sample would be obtained from the police database. And critically, Daniel Webb would be compelled to provide a DNA sample for comparison purposes. This last part was the most legally complicated. Daniel Webb wasn't charged with anything, wasn't under investigation, and had constitutional rights against self-incrimination. But Judge Reeves found sufficient probable cause to issue the order based on the constellation of factors: the identical twin relationship, the pattern of alleged violence, and the lack of alibis. Daniel would be ordered to appear for DNA collection, and if he refused, he could be held in contempt and potentially arrested. Marcus listened to all of this in stunned silence. He had a twin brother, an identical twin named Daniel, who might be the person who'd actually committed these murders. The information was so enormous, so reality-shifting, that Marcus couldn't fully process it. For 3 years, he'd been alone with his innocence, unable to explain how his DNA had appeared at crime scenes. Now, suddenly, there was an explanation. A horrible, tragic explanation that meant his genetic double had not only committed terrible crimes, but had inadvertently condemned Marcus to life imprisonment. After the hearing concluded, Marcus was allowed a brief consultation with his attorney. The public defender, suddenly energized by the possibility of an actual innocent client, explained what would happen next. The DNA testing would take approximately 3 to 4 months. Dr. Kowalski would analyze samples from both Marcus and Daniel, looking for the somatic mutations that would allow her to determine which twins' DNA was actually present at the crime scenes. If the analysis showed that the crime scene DNA matched Daniel rather than Marcus, it would be grounds for a new trial or potentially immediate release. But the attorney was careful to manage expectations. This was still a long shot. The science was new and would face scrutiny, and even if Dr. Kowalski could distinguish between the twins' DNA, there would be legal battles about the admissibility of the evidence. The justice system moves slowly and resists correcting its mistakes. Marcus needed to prepare himself for a long fight, and for the very real possibility that even this wouldn't be enough. Marcus was transported back to Whitmore that evening, returned to his cell as darkness fell. But something had fundamentally changed. For the first time in 3 years, he had hope. It was a dangerous thing to feel, hope. It made you vulnerable. If this led to nothing, if the testing failed or proved inconclusive, the psychological devastation would be worse than anything he'd experienced so far. But he couldn't help it. The human heart, even one beaten down by injustice, reaches toward the possibility of redemption, like a flower toward sunlight. That night, Marcus allowed himself to think about the future for the first time since his arrest. He thought about what he would do if he was freed, where he would go, whether he could somehow rebuild a life after losing years to a nightmare. He thought about his brother, this stranger who shared his face and DNA, but had apparently become something monstrous. He felt a strange, complicated grief for both the victims and for this person he'd never met who'd destroyed so many lives, including his own. Daniel Webb received the court order to provide a DNA sample on a Tuesday afternoon. A process server found him at the apartment complex where he'd been living for the past year, handed him the paperwork, and informed him that failure to comply would result in arrest and contempt charges. Daniel read the order with increasing panic, his face draining of color as he understood what was happening. They'd found Marcus. They were connecting the dots. After years of careful planning and good fortune, his perfect crime was unraveling. Daniel had known about Marcus for most of his life. Their adoptive parents had told him the truth when he was 12, explaining that he'd been born a twin but separated at birth. The other boy had gone into foster care while Daniel had been placed with a family. The unfairness of it had eaten at Daniel, knowing that there was another version of himself out there who'd drawn the short straw in life, while Daniel had gotten stability and privilege. He'd become obsessed with finding Marcus, with understanding what his twin's life was like. When Daniel finally tracked Marcus down in their mid-20s, he'd observed him from a distance, never making contact. Marcus was working warehouse jobs, living alone, struggling financially but staying clean and out of trouble. Daniel had felt contempt watching him, this diminished version of himself who'd accepted a small, insignificant life. Daniel had been given every advantage and still felt empty inside, still felt the rage that had been building since childhood. The rage that had first manifested when he'd hurt that girl in high school, an incident his adoptive parents had made disappear through expensive lawyers and sealed juvenile records. The idea had come to Daniel gradually. If Marcus shared his exact DNA, then Marcus could be his scapegoat. Daniel could commit the acts that the dark part of his mind craved, could satisfy the violent impulses that had only grown stronger over the years, and the evidence would point to an innocent man who'd never be able to explain it. It was almost beautiful in its simplicity. All Daniel had to do was be careful never to leave fingerprints or other identifying evidence. Only DNA through hair or skin cells that would match his unknowing twin. The first murder had been terrifying and exhilarating. Sarah Brennan had been selected almost at random, a woman Daniel had observed coming and going from her house during one of his long drives through the city. He'd planned meticulously, studied her routine, chosen a night when she'd be alone. Breaking in had been easier than he'd expected. The act itself had been worse than he'd imagined, not in moral terms, but in the physical reality of ending a human life. It was messy and took longer than he'd thought. But afterward, driving away with his heart pounding and his clothes burned in an industrial dumpster miles away, Daniel had felt more alive than ever before. When the police announced they were looking for suspects and collecting DNA from the area, Daniel had held his breath. But months passed and nothing happened. The case went cold. Daniel had gotten away with it, just as he'd planned. The second murder, 8 months later, was easier. He knew what to expect now, had refined his approach. The third murder was almost routine, though the escalating police pressure and media attention added a new thrill. Serial killers got famous. Daniel liked the idea of being important, even if no one could ever know it was him. Then Marcus had been arrested, and Daniel had watched the news coverage with fascination. His plan had worked even better than expected. Not only had the DNA evidence pointed away from him, it had pointed directly at someone specific. Marcus's face on television, confused and protesting innocence, had given Daniel a dark satisfaction. His weak, pathetic twin was taking the punishment Daniel deserved, and there was nothing Marcus could do about it. DNA doesn't lie. Everyone kept saying it. The irony was delicious. For 3 years, Daniel had lived without consequences. He'd stopped killing, not out of remorse, but because the risk was too high now that police were hypervigilant. He'd divorced his wife when she'd started asking too many questions about his whereabouts and strange behavior. He'd moved several times, worked various sales jobs, maintained the appearance of normalcy. And in quiet moments, he'd thought about Marcus in prison and felt nothing but contempt. His twin had always been a victim, had accepted victimhood his entire life. Now he was the ultimate victim, and Daniel felt he'd gotten exactly what he deserved for being so weak. But now, holding this court order, Daniel felt real fear for the first time. Advanced DNA testing that could distinguish between twins. It sounded like science fiction, but the order was real, signed by a judge. Daniel's mind raced through his options. He could run, disappear, start over somewhere with a new identity. But that would only confirm guilt. He could comply with the order and hope the testing was unreliable, hope that the new methodology wouldn't actually work. He could get a lawyer, fight the order, claim harassment. But any resistance would draw more attention. Daniel chose to comply, but to plan simultaneously. He provided the DNA sample as ordered, showing up at the designated medical facility with false calm, rolling up his sleeve for the cheek swab that might ultimately convict him. He was polite, cooperative, gave the technician no reason to find him suspicious. But inside, his mind was working through contingencies. If the testing went against him, If they determined that his DNA rather than Marcus's was at the crime scenes, Daniel would need to act fast. The months while Dr. Kowalski conducted her analysis were agony for everyone involved. For Marcus, locked in his cell at Whitmore, every day felt like a year as he waited for results that could mean freedom or continued imprisonment. For Harold Brennan, the waiting was torture of a different kind, wondering if his pursuit of truth would vindicate the man convicted of killing his daughter or confirm that justice had been properly served. For Dr. Kowalski, the pressure was immense. She was aware that her methodology was under intense scrutiny, that the fate of a human being depended on her accuracy, that the entire field of forensic genetics would be watching her work. Dr. Kowalski approached the analysis with painstaking care. She sequenced the DNA from the crime scenes at depths far beyond standard forensic testing, looking for the tiny mutations that accumulate in somatic cells over a lifetime. She sequenced Marcus's DNA similarly, building a comprehensive map of his unique genetic signature. And she sequenced Daniel's DNA with the same thoroughness. The work required cutting-edge equipment and techniques at the absolute frontier of genetic science. Every result was checked and double-checked. Every conclusion was verified through multiple methodologies. After 3.5 months of intensive work, Dr. Kowalski completed her analysis. She prepared a detailed report running to 68 pages, filled with technical genetic data, statistical analysis, and scientific conclusions. But the essential finding could be stated simply: the DNA found at all 3 crime scenes was consistent with Daniel Webb's genetic signature and inconsistent with Marcus Webb's signature. The somatic mutations present in the crime scene DNA matched Daniel, not Marcus. The probability that this match was coincidental was calculated at less than 1 in 500 million. Marcus Webb had been telling the truth. He was innocent. His twin brother, a person he'd never met, had committed 3 brutal murders and inadvertently condemned Marcus to life in prison. The science was clear. The truth was undeniable. Providence had acted through the tools of human knowledge, forcing reality into the light no matter how uncomfortable that reality might be. The release of Dr. Kowalski's findings created an immediate crisis in the justice system. To Catherine Mills, who'd supported the testing expecting it would confirm Marcus Webb's guilt, was instead confronted with irrefutable evidence that her office had convicted an innocent man. The political calculus that had seemed so simple became suddenly complicated. Mills could try to fight the findings, cast doubt on the methodology, protect the conviction, or she could acknowledge the error and work to correct it. Her career hung in the balance. Mills chose acknowledgement, but not out of conscience. Her political advisors made clear that attempting to suppress or dispute solid scientific evidence would be catastrophic if the truth eventually emerged anyway. Better to get ahead of the story, frame herself as a champion of truth who'd been willing to reopen a case and accept difficult findings. It was damage control dressed up as integrity, but the practical result was the same. Mills held a press conference announcing that based on new forensic evidence, her office believed Marcus Webb was innocent and would be moving immediately for his release and exoneration. The press conference was a media sensation. A man wrongly convicted of serial murder based on DNA evidence that turned out to belong to his unknown identical twin. It was the kind of story that captured national attention, raising profound questions about forensic science, twin studies, and the fallibility of the justice system. News trucks descended on the courthouse. Legal experts appeared on cable news to discuss the implications. And somewhere in a cell at Whitmore Correctional Facility, Marcus Webb watched the press conference on a small television, tears streaming down his face as he heard the DA say the words he'd dreamed of for 3 years. "We got it wrong. Marcus Webb is innocent." But acknowledging innocence and achieving actual release were 2 different processes. The legal mechanisms for exonerating a convicted person are complex and slow, designed with multiple safeguards to prevent premature reversals of justice. Marcus's attorney filed an emergency motion for release pending a full exoneration hearing. The motion included Dr. Kowalski's report, affidavits from Harold Brennan, documentation of Daniel Webb's history, and prosecutorial support from DA Mills. It was as strong a motion as could be constructed. Judge Reeves scheduled an expedited hearing for 1 week later. During that week, Marcus existed in a strange limbo. The other inmates at Whitmore had heard about his case on the news. Some treated him with new respect, even kindness, apologizing for past hostility. Others remained suspicious, unable or unwilling to accept that the justice system could make such a fundamental error. The guards were professionally neutral, but several expressed quiet support. One older officer told Marcus he'd always had doubts that Marcus hadn't fit the profile of the men who usually came through for violent crimes against women. Daniel Webb, meanwhile, had gone into full flight mode. The day Dr. Kowalski's findings were announced, Daniel withdrew what money he could access, packed essential items, and disappeared. Police went to his apartment to question him and found it abandoned. A warrant was immediately issued for his arrest on 3 counts of first-degree murder. His photo was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. Daniel Webb, the actual killer, was now a fugitive. The manhunt for Daniel provided an additional layer of vindication for Marcus. The fact that Daniel ran was powerful evidence of guilt. If the DNA findings were somehow mistaken, if Daniel was innocent, he would have stayed to fight the charges. His flight was effectively a confession. But it also meant that a serial killer was on the loose, potentially dangerous, and motivated by desperation. Police warned the public to be cautious and to report any sightings immediately. The exoneration hearing took place on a cold December morning. The courtroom was packed with media, legal observers, and members of the public drawn by the extraordinary nature of the case. Marcus was brought in wearing civilian clothes for the first time in 3 years, provided by Harold Brennan, who'd taken on an almost paternal role in Marcus's fight for freedom. Marcus looked thin and tired, marked by his time in prison, but there was light in his eyes that had been absent before. The hearing was surprisingly brief. Judge Reeves had reviewed all the evidence in detail. Dr. Kowalski testified again, walking through her methodology and findings. An independent genetic expert testified that he'd reviewed Dr. Kowalski's work and found it scientifically sound. The prosecution, represented again by Ada Torres but clearly acting under instructions from Catherine Mills, did not contest the findings. Torres stood and stated for the record that the district attorney's office believed Marcus Webb had been wrongfully convicted and supported his immediate release and full exoneration. Judge Reeves delivered his ruling from the bench without lengthy deliberation. The DNA evidence was the cornerstone of Marcus Webb's conviction, he stated. If that evidence was misattributed, if it belonged to another person, then the conviction could not stand. The new forensic analysis, conducted by reputable scientists using peer-reviewed methodology, clearly demonstrated that the DNA at the crime scenes belonged to Daniel Webb, not Marcus Webb. There was no other significant evidence linking Marcus to the crimes. Therefore, the court was vacating all convictions against Marcus Webb, ordering his immediate release, and issuing a declaration of factual innocence. The gavel came down. Marcus Webb was a free man. The courtroom erupted in applause, an unusual breach of decorum that Judge Reeves allowed to continue for several long moments. Marcus stood at the defense table, shaking, unable to fully process what had just happened. 3 years of nightmare were over. He was free. Actually, legally, impossibly free. Harold Brennan approached Marcus as court officers removed his restraints. The 2 men looked at each other, connected by the worst moment of both their lives. Harold extended his hand and Marcus took it. Then the older man pulled him into a fierce embrace. "I'm sorry," Harold whispered. "I'm so sorry for what you went through." "Thank you," Marcus managed to say. "Thank you for believing me, for finding the truth." The moment was raw and honest, 2 men united by suffering and the long road to justice. The first days of freedom were overwhelming for Marcus Webb. He'd been released with a voucher for temporary housing, a small amount of state-provided funds, and the clothes on his back. The world he emerged into felt alien after 3 years inside. Smartphones had evolved, social media had changed. Even simple things like ordering food or navigating a city felt complicated and strange. Marcus experienced the disorientation common to released prisoners, but amplified by the surreal circumstances of his case. Harold Brennan provided crucial support during this transition. He helped Marcus find a modest apartment, co-signed the lease, provided furniture and basic necessities. He connected Marcus with a civil rights attorney to discuss a wrongful conviction lawsuit against the state. And he simply spent time with Marcus, helping him readjust, providing the human connection that Marcus desperately needed. Their relationship was unusual and profound, forged in shared trauma and the pursuit of truth. Marcus struggled with complex emotions about his twin brother. He'd never met Daniel, had only learned of his existence during his fight for exoneration, but Daniel was responsible for destroying Marcus's life, for committing horrible crimes that Marcus had been blamed for. Marcus felt anger, certainly, but also a strange, hollow sadness for this person who shared his genetics but had become something terrible. What had made Daniel into a killer while Marcus had remained law-abiding despite a much harder childhood? Was it nature or nurture? Luck or choice? These questions haunted Marcus in quiet moments. The media attention was intense and unwelcome. Marcus's story had become national news. Reporters wanted interviews, television producers wanted exclusives, true crime podcasts wanted his perspective. Marcus declined almost all of it, overwhelmed by the attention and still processing his trauma. He did agree to one interview with a serious journalist from a major newspaper, hoping to tell his story accurately and to advocate for other wrongly convicted people. The interview was published under the headline, "The Man His DNA Condemned, Marcus Webb's 3-Year Nightmare." It was sensitively written and helped shift public perception toward sympathy for Marcus rather than morbid curiosity. While Marcus worked to rebuild his life, the search for Daniel Webb intensified. Federal authorities joined the manhunt, recognizing that Daniel might have crossed state lines and that he posed a significant public danger. Psychological profiles suggested he was capable of violence if cornered, particularly toward law enforcement or anyone he perceived as threatening. The public was warned to not approach him if spotted, but to contact police immediately. Daniel had actually managed to evade capture for 6 weeks after his disappearance, moving between small towns, staying in cheap motels, using cash to avoid creating a digital trail. But he made a critical mistake in late January. Desperate and paranoid, running low on money, Daniel attempted to rob a convenience store in rural Indiana, believing he could take cash and disappear before police responded. But the store clerk triggered a silent alarm, and local police arrived within 3 minutes. When officers entered the store, Daniel panicked. He'd brought a knife but no gun, not wanting to escalate to armed robbery. But confronted by police who didn't immediately recognize him as a wanted fugitive, Daniel made a move toward the weapon. An officer, young and nervous, fired twice. Both shots hit Daniel in the chest. He died on the floor of the convenience store before an ambulance could arrive, his blood spreading across cheap linoleum tiles as the clerk watched in horror. The irony of Daniel's death was not lost on observers. He'd ended the lives of 3 innocent women with violence, had destroyed his twin brother's life, had spent years evading consequences, and he died in the most mundane way possible, during a botched convenience store robbery, killed by a nervous cop who probably didn't even know who he was shooting. There was no dramatic confrontation, no chance for Daniel to explain or confess or face his victims' families. Just sudden, random death in a forgettable store in a forgettable town. Marcus learned of Daniel's death from a phone call from Harold Brennan, who'd been notified by police. Marcus's first reaction was relief that Daniel couldn't hurt anyone else. His second reaction was unexpected grief, not for the man Daniel had been, but for the possibility that had been lost. The brother he might have known under different circumstances. Marcus would never get answers now. Never understand what had driven Daniel to murder. Never have the chance to ask why Daniel had been content to let him rot in prison for crimes he hadn't committed. Those questions would remain unanswered forever. A memorial service was held for Sarah Brennan and the other 2 victims 6 months after Marcus's exoneration. Harold organized it, wanting to honor his daughter and the other women while also acknowledging that justice, though delayed and imperfect, had eventually been served. Marcus attended, standing in the back of the church, feeling like an intruder but knowing he needed to be there. Several of the victims' family members approached him afterward, telling him they were sorry for what he'd been through, that they understood he'd been a victim too. Those conversations were healing in a way Marcus hadn't expected. For years, he'd carried guilt about those women's deaths, not because he'd caused them, but because his DNA had been used to perpetrate them, because in some cosmic sense he'd been involuntarily connected to their suffering. Hearing their families absolve him of that burden, recognizing that he'd lost years of life to a crime he didn't commit, allowed Marcus to begin forgiving himself for something that had never been his fault. 2 years after his release, Marcus Webb had built something resembling a normal life. The wrongful conviction lawsuit had been settled for a substantial amount, providing him financial stability for the first time in his life. He'd used some of the money to go back to school, studying criminal justice with the intention of working to prevent future miscarriages of justice. He'd been in therapy dealing with PTSD from his imprisonment, and he'd started speaking publicly about forensic science reform, arguing for better safeguards when DNA evidence was used in criminal cases. Dr. Jennifer Kowalski's career had flourished following the Webb case. Her methodology for differentiating twin DNA had been validated in the most public way possible, and she'd published extensively on the case with Marcus's permission. She'd been invited to consult on several other cases where twin identification was relevant, and she'd become an advocate for continuous improvement in forensic science, arguing that the field needed to remain humble about its limitations and open to new technologies that might correct past errors. Harold Brennan had found unexpected peace through his role in Marcus's exoneration. The obsessive research that had nearly cost him his sanity had ultimately served justice, had honored his daughter by ensuring the right person was held accountable for her death, even if that person never faced trial. Harold and Marcus remained close, meeting regularly, their bond transcending the tragedy that had brought them together. Harold had also become active in wrongful conviction advocacy, working with organizations that fought to free innocent people and to reform the systems that had imprisoned them. Catherine Mills, the ambitious DA who'd prosecuted Marcus, did run for Attorney General. During the campaign, she positioned herself as a prosecutor committed to both justice and humility, willing to admit mistakes and correct them. She won the election, in part because her role in Marcus's exoneration had enhanced rather than damaged her reputation. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, that the person who'd convicted him had benefited politically from freeing him. But Marcus had learned that justice is rarely pure, that good outcomes can emerge from mixed motives, that providence works through flawed human instruments. The Webb case became a landmark in forensic science, cited in textbooks and legal journals as an example of both the power and limitations of DNA evidence. It sparked important discussions about how courts should handle cases involving identical twins, about the need for continuous validation of forensic methodologies, and about the importance of maintaining skepticism, even about seemingly irrefutable evidence. Several other cases were reopened based on similar principles, with at least 3 resulting in exonerations. Marcus occasionally thought about Daniel, his unknown twin who'd caused such devastation. He'd learned more about Daniel's background through police reports and media coverage. Daniel had been given advantages that Marcus never had: a stable adoptive family, education, opportunities. Yet somehow Daniel had become a killer while Marcus, despite foster care and instability, had remained decent. Marcus didn't understand it, and eventually accepted that he never would. Human psychology was too complex, the factors that create a murderer too multifaceted for simple explanation. On the 3-year anniversary of his release, Marcus visited Sarah Brennan's grave for the first time. He brought flowers and stood silently, not praying exactly but acknowledging her memory, the life she'd lived, the injustice of her death. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered to the stone. "I'm sorry for what my brother did to you. I'm sorry I couldn't stop him even though I didn't know he existed. I promise I'll honor your memory by doing something good with the life I got back." As Marcus walked back to his car, he reflected on the strange path his life had taken. 3 years in hell for crimes he didn't commit. Saved by science that hadn't existed when he'd been convicted. Supported by the father of a victim who'd believed in his innocence when nobody else did. It was a story that shouldn't have been possible. A nightmare that shouldn't have happened. A redemption that had required providence to align impossible circumstances in exactly the right way. Marcus drove home, to the small apartment that was truly his, to the life he was building one day at a time. He was 34 years old, and in some ways felt ancient, marked by experiences that most people couldn't imagine. But he was free. He was innocent. And he was, against all odds, still alive and capable of hope. The DNA that had condemned him had ultimately saved him when examined with sufficient precision to reveal the truth. That night, Marcus sat at his small desk and wrote in the journal his therapist had suggested he keep. He wrote about the anniversary, about visiting Sarah's grave, about the complicated gratitude he felt for everyone who'd fought for his freedom. And he wrote something he'd been thinking about for weeks. Maybe I'm supposed to use what happened to me. Maybe having been wrongly convicted gives me insight and credibility to help others. Maybe surviving this nightmare means I have an obligation to prevent other nightmares. It was the beginning of a new purpose, born from injustice but oriented toward hope. Marcus Webb, who'd been crushed by a system that should have protected him, would spend the rest of his life trying to fix that system. Not from bitterness or revenge, but from the hard-won understanding that justice requires constant vigilance, that truth requires persistent pursuit, and that providence works through people willing to fight for both. The DNA had lied, in a sense. It had told a truth, that Webb DNA was at the crime scene, but it had lied about which Webb. That simple biological fact, that identical twins share identical genetics, had been sufficient to condemn an innocent man for years. But science had also saved him, when human ingenuity found a way to look deeper, to see the tiny differences that accumulated over time, to distinguish between two people who'd seemed indistinguishable. Marcus closed his journal and turned off his desk lamp. Tomorrow he had a meeting with a wrongful conviction organization that wanted his input on a case. Another person sitting in prison, maintaining innocence, waiting for someone to believe them. Marcus would review the file, would look for the details that others might miss, would fight as hard for this stranger as Harold and Dr. Kowalski had fought for him. Because that's what surviving injustice had taught him. Every person wrongly convicted deserves someone who won't give up, who won't accept the easy answer, who will pursue truth regardless of how impossible it seems. Marcus Webb had been given a second chance at life. He would spend it giving other people the same chance, one case at a time, one truth at a time, until his dying day. The nightmare was over. The work had just begun. And somewhere in the mysterious machinery of the universe, Providence continued its slow, imperfect, essential work of bending the arc of history toward justice.